Now recording. Let's see, today is April 26th, 2018. This is the normally scheduled meeting of ITSE 2309 at Collin College. This is Stephen Smith, and the class today we are going to be doing Module 14. This module is out of sequence because the we just decided to do 14 before 13. Module 13 is pretty easy. And since we have one more class meeting, I chose to put the fairly simple module at the very last. So for today, module 14, and the file I'm going to be using is attached. Module 14, we are going to be creating views. Let me get to that. Let's see, it would help if I'd get to the correct class. And under modules, this will be the last module before the final exam, using database views. And I see I have one down here that I'm not sure what I did in that. I'm creating a trigger. That's really from the next class. Creating a view. A view, database view, is essentially like you had when you, oh, thank you. Been advised my overhead is not on. I can see it just fine. Now, if you had joined the meeting on Zoom, you'd be able to see it on your screen. But turning on the overhead. Okay, let me, up. Creating a view in SQL is like Access does when you create a view, or when you create a query. When you create a query in Access, you actually save it in the database. So in reality, in Access, it's not a query that you're creating, it's a view. You give it a name, and it acts to you like a table. You can write other queries that act on that query. And in fact, this is an example of a subquery. So I can always, in a subquery, I can always take the subquery, create a view, and then treat that subquery just like a table. Okay. In fact, that's what I would probably do if I were going to use that subquery very long or in something, because I think it is better for people to understand. It certainly makes your code shorter if you break it up into a view. A view does not add any cost really to your database, particularly because it does not duplicate the data. So when you select from a view, to you it looks just like a table, acts just like a table, but it's really the output of an SQL select statement. Okay. In Access, you have other queries. You have, update queries and create table queries, and that I'm not really going to cover them until next semester. Okay, so I have a view, any view. Let's start with this one. And I believe I have this over here in my, okay, plain old SQL select statement. Select everything from vendors, but I only want the ones where the state is California. So if I were to run this, I would see my California vendors. Okay, I'm going to name this view California vendors. Now, this is important, and it's not mentioned in the module. Well, when you create a view, it must be inside of its own Go block. I don't think it needs a Go after it, but it's not a bad idea. It's generally not wrong to put a Go statement. Sometimes if you use too many of them, they can slow you down. because that says, okay, you have to stop and make sure everything has completed. But when you create a view, you must have it must be the first thing in the go block. And I usually put a go after it. Okay. So if I forget to do this, I will get an error message. So this is the first time that we've had one where we had to have it. It's a good idea to have a go after any create statement, such as creating a table. I use a go. Once I create a table, and then I have a go after it. A views are more tricky about that. So create view. California Dreamin', California viewers as, and inside of that is my select statement, and that's really all there is to it. Now, instead of saving the SQL as a text file in my file system, I have the SQL compiled and saved in the database as an object, so it has its own name. Like any other object, if it already exists, you can't create it again. Some databases give you the option of using the word, instead of create, there's one called create or replace in Oracle, and I find that to be handy. However, in SQL Server, we just have to have the if it exists, then drop it, which amounts to the same thing. So if I want to run this more than one time, I will have to do it. Now, when I create this view, if I select it, I don't have to select the go block. When I select it, it's inside of its own block. Okay. Guess I forgot to drop it. Okay, so here it's now created. And now I would be able to say, select everything from California vendors as if it were a table. Notice that vendor ID 4 is job track, and he has vendor state is California, CA anyway. What would happen if I updated California vendors and set the vendor state to TX, where the vendor ID is equal to 4? Question is, can I do that? Can I update, essentially, an SQL query? The answer is yes. If I were to execute this, it will update just fine. And when I run it again, I will not see that vendor ID 4. First one is 6. He's gone. Okay. Now views are very handy to use if you have if you're in a situation, a doctor's office, or something like that, where your database is fairly fluid. Churches, for example, would probably be similar. People come, people go, people move, get mad, and you tend to have a lot of turnover in some places. Doctors' offices are good ones, but you still have to keep that patient's records. Don't care where the patient goes. Even if they die, you still have to keep their record. So the way I usually do that is I have a field in the patient's data, and I call that field active. And that field is either yes or no. Now, some databases give you a Boolean field. What does Boolean mean? Do you know that word, Kathy? Boolean? True or false? Yes or no? Since SQL Server gives us what they call a tiny int, which is a 1-byte integer, that's as small as you can work with anyway. I usually use that for a Boolean, and 0 is false, and anything else is true. So I could use 255 as true, or whatever, as long as it's not 0, as long as I've got a difference between them. And then I would create a view that says, show me my active clients, select everything from the table where the active field is not equal to 0. When I delete a field from that, and one of the first things we're going to do in the next semester is I'll show you how to change the delete behavior so that when you say delete, it doesn't really delete. What it does, it goes in and sets that field to 0. It disappears. So the person who's deleting that record thinks it's gone. It's not really gone. It's still there. You just change the field to 0. You can go back in, find that record, change that field back to 1, and it magically reappears in your view. So I can change it through a view. So if I delete it from the view, what happens is if I delete the record, if I say delete from the view, it is deleted from the database. If I change it from California to TX or any other state, it no longer appears in the database. Okay. Now, this might be my next slide. This might be a security option. Why? Well, you frequently use views when you need to restrict the information that a user is allowed to see. You don't let the user, because I have a very fine granularity of control here, I can, remember we created a user and our user is the database owner. We're going to find out very quickly now, next class, that you can have lots of different users, that these users get certain access to the database, whatever you give them. You don't have to give them access to the table. You can give them access to a view, and you can allow them to select from the view. Okay. If I allow you to select from a view, that means that there's something in the table that I don't want you to be able to see under any conditions. I don't want you to be able to modify it either. If you can, but I'm going to let you update the view. So you can change anything that you're allowed to see. But if I let you change something such that that record no longer appears in the view, you have changed the set of records that you're not allowed to see. You following my logic there? So if I don't want you to be able to do that, now sometimes you want to do this, sometimes you don't. If I, for example, if I were in that setting of a doctor's office where I have that field called active, and if it's 1, you're active, if it's 0, you're not, maybe I want you to be able to update that. There's probably no reason that I have to not show you the active records. You just don't want to mess with them, the inactive records. So I'd let you do that. But maybe, for example, if I've done it this way a lot of times, let's see, who gets to see your human resources records file? Who gets to see your HR file? HR, okay. So your personnel jacket is restricted only to HR. So if your department is HR, you get to look at the HR jackets. Who manages the HR's personnel jacket? And the answer is HR can't do that. Somebody else has to do that. That typically falls to finance or to the accounting department, whatever that is. All right. So HR manages accounting, accounting manages HRs. So you would do that with views. So HR view would select everything from the personnel jackets where the department is not equal to HR. Over in accounting, they get another view, but the where in that one is where it is equal to HR. So now between the views, I have the ability to do it. But you know, if someone, and I would set that one up where you couldn't change it. Now this is how we do it with that. It's not much different. Create view California vendors as, select everything from vendors where vendor state is California with check option. Okay. Some of them will let you get away with just saying with check. Now, this one, go ahead, what please? Well, notice that, let me go back over here and let's see, what was that job track? Change it back to California. So job track is in California. Let me create it with the check option. Okay. And let's execute. Now, how did we get into that view? The vendor state had to be CA. So if this works, I have updated the view, changing a record such that it is no longer in the view. I have changed the set of records that are not in the view. So I've updated the record such that I can no longer see it in the view. That might not be what you want to be able to happen. This is the first real security matter. Because if I let, oh, I don't know, I'm going to let Kathy see only the records from California, because you're the manager from California. So all of the records that are in California, so this would be Kathy's view. But I'm not going to let her change a record and send it over to Texas. You can change anything else, but you can't change that field because that's the field that makes it appear in your view. When I try to execute this, I'm going to get an error. Attempted update failed because the target view either specifies with check option, that's what, and you're trying, and we're violating it. You can insert into a view, but you cannot insert a record that doesn't appear in the view if you have with check option. If you don't have it, then anything goes. Questions? That's an important point about views. As a rule, emphasis on the word rule, a view is not ordered. Now, what I'm going to tell you right now, what I'm going to talk about, does not, SQL Server lets you get away with this, but not all platforms do. Okay, if you go to MySQL or Oracle, it won't. SQL Server will let you create a view from an ordered query. Not all will, because a view is a table is not ordered. Okay? So, for example, if I wanted to select the, I don't know why I would want the top 10 vendor IDs from vendors order by vendor ID. Well, if I'm going to select the top 10, that implies that I'm ordering it by something. Could say descending. So if I tried to create this view, SQL Server would create the view. In general, a view is not ordered. Okay? A view gets ordered when you select something from the view. Your order by goes at a higher level. You can still order the output just fine, but you'd say select everything from the view where such and such, order by whatever. So it's in that outside SQL statement where it gets ordered. It is not ordered in the creation of the view usually. Now, don't count on it. Okay, pretend it won't. Most platforms will not. Most platforms will give you an error when you try to put order by in the statement that creates the view. Yes, in many databases. in Oracle, that would barf in Oracle. Okay. We have a way to get around it. Okay, here is the way to get around it is we create just a simple little subselect. In other words, I bury it in a derived table in a subquery. So I can have a subquery that's ordered, select everything from that ordered subquery, take my top 10 out of that. I don't do top 10 very often. And then I don't know that the rows in that view will be ordered, but I will have all 10 of them. And if the underlying table changes, the view will change. Okay. Questions? This is where a subselect is very handy. It is best if you don't create a view using an order by. I can get around it easily. All I have to do is just bury it in a subquery and select everything from the subquery. Does that make sense? Nick, we cool? Okay. Okay, what time is it? I'm going to pause for just a second. I'm going to pause the recording for a moment. And I am now resuming my recording. Okay. Let's see, in the last class, was it the last class, in database design, I was throwing a fit over something that was in the invoices table, and that was the invoice totals, okay? And I pointed out that the invoice total should not be a field by itself. Why? Because it is derived from the lines in the invoice line items. So it's the sum of the invoice line items. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you what that was, I would hope that you might do something like this. You know, show me the invoice line, invoice ID, and the invoice totals. You might do something like this. I don't think you'll have a problem with a field in the SQL statement named invoice total, even though you have one in the table called invoice total. I don't think it'd be a problem. What's this doing? It's selecting from invoice line items, and it's adding up the invoice line item amount, grouping by invoice ID. So this is going to give me that invoice total. By the way, there is one record in there, one maybe two, that does not conform, where if you add them up, you have an invalid invoice total in the invoices that does not match the sum of the invoice line items. There's one in there. And I'm famous for telling you to find it with SQL. I think I tell you on the slide, I tell you what the invoice number is that has an invalid invoice line item, invoice amount on it, so you'll know when you found it. But this will give me the accurate so if I were to run this, I'm going to get accurate, up-to-date invoice totals. Now, you know, we've got a problem there. When I put something into the invoice line items, when I add a line to the invoice line items, it changes the amount of the invoice total. So I would, if I added something to invoice line items, I would always have to go back over, recalculate, and update invoice line items. Now I can do that automatically in SQL. You will learn how to do that next semester in the next class. But I really don't want to do that. I don't want it in two places. Two places, having the information in two places just gives me two places I can be wrong. If I just have it in one place, I can only be wrong in one place. I hate being right in one place and wrong in the other. So I would probably create a view out of this. So create view, invoice totals, plural. And this gives me the invoice ID, the primary key, and the accurate information from the invoice line items. Everything's up to date in Kansas City. Now, so create the view. Okay, I'm going to select everything, invoices I and T. Notice I'm taking the invoice ID from I, vendor ID, invoice total, invoice date. Now I'm taking the invoice total from the view I just created. Payment total, credit total, terms ID, all this stuff just comes from the invoices table. It's not in the invoice totals. And when I run this, I get something that looks just like the invoices table. Let's see. But the totals are correct. And notice that I have a null in there. Now that is one that does not have, that's an invoice ID. There's an invoice, but it does not have any line items. Bingo, I just found my problem. It's not supposed to be there. Right? I mean, if I have an invoice, aren't I supposed to have at least one line item? I think that's a rule that I have. I don't know where it ever tells you that. That you just have to figure out for yourself. Doesn't make any sense to have an invoice for nothing. All right. Well, there's an invoice for nothing. No items, but it's an invoice. Maybe it's Spirit of America or something. I don't know. But the rest of these are all guaranteed. Now, if I were to pull this from, so the payment total is $224 they paid, but they don't have any items. Well, okay, I'll let you worry about that. But notice that this highlights that, that brings that up for me. They're not supposed to be in the invoices if they don't have any invoice line items. They can not have a terms ID. I guess that's okay. That's not bothering me as much as that bad data. I would create the view. This guy needs a go. Notice he's giving me a red line. The reason he gave me the red line is because I don't have, he's not in the go block, I guess. Okay. They like to be creating views likes to be bracketed by goes. We're going to see that when we create code in the next piece of the course, where we're getting to very quickly, when we create code, we're going to have to bracket the code in goes. Up until now, Go has been pretty much optional. I would have used it after create table, go. Create table, go is the way I would have done that. Sometimes it works and sometimes it didn't. So I would create my view based on based on these guys. Fuss over my format. There isn't any perfect format. Although I act like there isn't. Put some thought into it. Notice how I'm indenting. I personally like it when things line up, but if I move to a different editor or something or change my font size, then they won't line up anymore. Oh well. But here's the select statement, and I've created a view. And what do I have inside the view is I'm selecting stuff from invoices, and I am selecting stuff from another view. So I'm stacking up 2 levels of views here. I could have, that second view, invoice totals, could have been a subselect. Yeah. I find it usually better, in my opinion, to go ahead and create a view. I think it documents it better. Then I would keep that information around as part of the documentation of my database, so that I'd have a thick manual of code where I had created these views. So I would have the first view, creating the view invoice totals, plural, and then creating this view. So well, I hate it when that happens. So now I just treat it like a table. So my invoices table became new invoices. I can leave invoices laying around. Well, I have to leave invoices laying around. I can't just get rid of it because, remember, new invoices is based on invoices. What I would do, though, at some point later, by the way, I can update anything. I can add records to this view. So I can add an invoice to the view. If I add an invoice to the view, it will not have any invoice line items. Okay. That's fine. It doesn't hurt anything. As long as if I have a null value in there, that's fine. That just tells me I don't have any line items yet. Maybe I'm going to add them later. That doesn't hurt me. What hurts me is having a bad invoice total, an invoice total that is incorrect. Null, oh well, I have to have it. Sometimes I just have to allow nulls. Let's see, terms ID, invoice ID 1 has a terms ID of 3. So if I execute, and then I look at it again, notice that on terms ID 1, notice that he has changed to 2. So I changed the underlying table, the invoices table, using the view. I can insert, I can delete, I can update. What can I not do using the view? Yes, and what would that be offhand in this particular one? Information outside of invoices, where's that come from? Oh, come on. What'd we do here? Where does invoice total come from? Invoice total is not in the invoice. Well, it doesn't come from the invoices. It comes from the invoice totals table, if you like. It's really a view. How is it derived? Okay, it's an aggregate. I hate when I copy stuff over, it doesn't always do my tabs right. Oh, well. Okay, he's an aggregate. I can't update an aggregate. I can't update the sum. I say, you know, what's the sum of 3 and 4 and 5? 7, 12. Okay, what I say, change that sum to 13. Huh? Which one do I change? You can't do it. Therefore, what can I not update? Aggregate. I can insert into the invoices table through the view, I believe. I just don't give it a value for invoice total. So if I insert a row into new invoices, I would just insert everything except invoice total. Then I would just have a null there and in the outer join, and then I would have to go put my invoice line items in. As soon as I put the invoice line items in, it would automatically update the view new invoices, would happen immediately. So when you put something into invoice line items, it's going to be reflected the next time you select from new invoices, and that's a far, far better way to do it. That's how I would fix it. Okay. You use views for that kind of stuff. So I use it to make, I use views for my convenience. For example, to keep a record of active clients and inactive clients. I don't want to delete my inactive clients. I can keep them in the same table. At some point, when I get so many of them that it's bogging me down, years and years later, I can take those inactive clients and write them to another table and put that one out on a DVD or something, where I can get to them. As it is, if I have a patient that is just inactive, they move, but they're very likely to come back and ask me for something from their records in the next month or two, I want to keep that right there where I can get to it quickly. It's no problem at all. I just switch over to a different view, pull up their record. But now my people who are doing data entry and working with the database don't have to see all of these inactive records unless they want to. So I'm free to update new invoices, update, insert, and delete from new invoices. I have to be careful. Deleting from new invoices does not delete the invoice line items. Okay. So that would be a, let's see, invoice line items isn't holding a foreign key into that field. So it would delete, it's got I think it has a foreign key, but if I deleted the parent record, it would leave records in the invoice line items table. So I need to deal with that. We'll deal with that in another, I think I touch on that at the end of this. I can insert a row. This particular insert just invoice due date. Notice that invoice date, due date payment date, I just do get date on all of those. In other words, I'm just time stamping it today. I could make it do 30 days from today or something like that. So if I said date add plus 30, invoice due date plus 30, probably I'd say a plus 30 here and null here because they haven't paid yet. Notice that I just didn't insert a total, and it will insert just fine. Oh, okay. I have a not null constraint on the existing invoice total. That's not going to let me do that. So if you try to do that, you have to disable the not null constraint. I would just disable it and make them all null. And then later, when I had everything working correctly, I'm very slow to do this. I'm very slow to use alter table. I like to use views. I like to leave that table there until I'm really, really, really sure it's going to work. And then I will alter the table. Altering the table is fairly drastic. Because I have changed the amount of disk space that each record has to have. So what have I done here? I've created fragmentation in my database. This is not good. I would probably wait until my time, every database has to have built into it maintenance time. There has to be a time when you say, okay, this database is offline. Every database is. Okay. The Amazon.com database has to go down. They just have enough databases to where they can hot switch over to another one. And you don't think it's ever down, but it is. And I would probably alter the table, dropping the column at some point where I had time to defragment the database. There are commands that will defragment, and they are, if it's a big table, it can easily take 2 or 3 hours, in which time your database has to be offline. Okay. So there, it's beyond the scope of this class's defragment, but basically it's just you take the database offline and you issue the defragment command and go home, go to bed. Questions? Let's see, I have some more stuff here. I've done this one. I've given you the example, invoice totals. Textbook discusses updating the database just as I did. Updatable views in chapter 13, pages 396 and 397. And it isn't real clear, are they talking about the formal command update, or are they talking about anything that changes that row? When I talk about it here, I mean update is the command update. I don't mean anything. In general, a field might be the subject of an update if the SQL creating the view does not use distinct or top. If it uses distinct or top, it is not updatable. There are no aggregate functions in the select line. So my view that what did I call it? Invoice totals, plural, would not be updatable, obviously. An aggregate function may be buried in the subselect. The view cannot be based on a union. And sometimes it's real handy to do. So this particular one, this is the SQL code that might have created the view new invoices. What's different about this? I'm not using the view invoice totals. I'm putting that code that created that view, I put that code in the subselect. You can do it either way, right? This code, let me put this over here just to compare it. I just gave it the name T, but this is the view. And many times when I have a subquery like that, when I have a derived table in a subquery, instead of putting the derived table in the subquery, I will create a view because I think it makes more sense to me. It makes my query shorter. Well, I still got to write the same number of lines of code, but it breaks it into logical pieces, and I think that's always good. So my own preference for this, notice that this and this are the same query, but the right-hand side of my outer join is a view. Down here, the right-hand side of my outer join is a derived table. A view is a derived table. So either one of these is fine. Okay, so 3 conditions. It cannot have a distinct or a top. It cannot have an aggregate function. It cannot be based on the union operator. If so, I can use update. I can update other fields. For example, since this one is based on only one field in here, invoice total is based on an aggregate, I can't update that field. I can update the rest of them. Insert, same thing, meets all requirements for update, and all of the required fields are either included in the view or are defaulted in the table. So a view does not have to have the primary key in it of the table. If the view does not have the primary key, then you cannot insert into that. How are you going to insert the primary key? Unless it is if it's an identity, you can insert, of course, if it's automatically inserted. But okay. If the SQL create view includes a join in it, then insert is restricted, and I'm not going into exactly what I mean. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. For example, in the invoices, it would allow me, the new invoices would allow me to insert into the outer table, but not the derived table, of course. Deleting meets all the requirements for update, and I cannot delete if it's based on a join or a subquery, because what would I do with the rows from the invoice line items table if I deleted from the invoices? Delete is by far the most restrictive. Okay, so I'll show you how we can code and get around that. To do that, I would have to reach into the next class. I don't know whether I do that in here or not. I thought I saw one. Okay, I got a quiz here. Let me go to my modules. Let's take a look at this. Download. This is from the next class. This is what we're going to do. In the next class. Now, I'm creating a couple of tables. I don't want to create a new vendors table. This one is, I'm calling that vendors A, so that's alternate. It's another one. And let's see, what do I have? Vendor active. This is the one I'm adding. Vendor active. And notice he's tiny int. What's tiny int? 1 byte, and its values range from 0 to 255. It's as small of a thing as I can get. Now, some databases tried, well, they tried in the past. SQL Server tried to have a Boolean data type, and they tried to pack 8 of them into a single byte. It was considered a disaster because the work to go in there and get 1 bit out of a byte was so great that they never made up for the little bit of memory or disk space that takes. The huge amount of overhead it put onto the database, it was just considered a very bad idea. So when you want to have a true or false data type, you use a tiny int. And when it's 1, it's true. When it's anything but 0 is false, and true is anything else, is the typical way to do it. So vendor active. Everything else is the same. Insert some stuff in there. Goodness gracious, I inserted a whole bunch of stuff, didn't I? Okay. Now, create a view where active vendors. So this is going to show me the vendors table as it appears in the database. Notice that vendor active does not appear here. I can't see vendor active. That field is not in the view. I don't have to say with check option. You can insert into this view, you can delete from this view, you can update this view, but you cannot see the field vendor active. It's not there. Everything else is just the same as you don't even know that it's there. You have no way of ever finding out. You don't have a clue how unless I give you the option to see the base table. Okay. Where vendor active is not 0. Now I can put other information into vendor active. Doesn't have to be 1 or 0. 0 means not active. 1 might mean something. 2 might mean something else. Okay. 0 means they're not active. And this one is non-active vendors. Okay, this is the other guys with check option. Okay. Now that's the way I would do it, this based on what we know how to do now. All righty. What time is it? 7:02. Does anyone need a break? I'm about to reach into the next class. The material I'm going to cover now will not appear on a test. Okay? Don't get your knickers in a big knot over it. Every database has with it, we have SQL. And SQL is supposed to be the same across databases. It isn't always. It is not perfectly the same. Every time you move from one database to another, you will have to tweak it a little bit. Most of what we have done, you won't. Go is not found in others. You don't find it in Oracle. Oracle has a different way of saying it. You don't find if object ID such and such is not null, drop the object. You don't find that. That wouldn't run in Oracle. What else wouldn't run in Oracle? Those are the main things. I've really tried to stick to stuff that is pure SQL. For example, we did not do the case statement. That's not found in SQL. We did not do the IIF. We did not do the with rollup or the cube stuff. That's not in SQL. That's done at a higher level. And I can do it, but it's not part of SQL. It's something that SQL Server has added to it. Nothing wrong with reading it, but it's not pure SQL. Okay, we're now stepping into the larger language. There is a language that's wrapped around SQL in every database, has its own names. And in this language, there are quite a few differences. Okay, so that would be a primary difference of them. So now what I'm saying is this syntax will only work in SQL Server. If you go to Oracle, there will be a different syntax. A trigger. I can create a trigger on a database for any operation that changes the data. What are the operations that change the data? Anything except select. I cannot trigger select. Okay, so I can trigger update, I can trigger delete, I can trigger insert, meaning I can write code that executes against the data set, and this code executes as the database owner. So when you do something, for example, this one, it says when this is a delete trigger. When you delete from this vendors, when you delete from the underlying table, I don't want you to delete. Instead of delete, okay, do this. Begin. Oh, what's begin? We haven't seen a begin. SQL doesn't have begin. Begins out in the other language. Set no count on. No count says don't tell me how many rows don't give me that message that says 5 rows affected. Just do it. I declare a variable vid. The table named deleted is passed to a delete function. Deleted is a reserved word, and that means the set of rows that you're about to delete. Before it happens, look at that table called deleted. That contains the set of rows that you would delete with this statement. Okay? This integer, find the vendor ID from deleted. Instead of delete, I want you to update the vendors, set vendor active equals 0, where vendor ID is what you just selected there. Now this will only work one at a time. It would be better to use an in statement. Instead of that, I got this somewhere, and it's not particularly good code. This is really better. Update vendors, where vendor ID is in. This would be a better trigger. Why? This one will only select one vendor ID. It's fine if you select one vendor ID. If you say delete one vendor ID, that's great. What if you delete 10 or 15 or all of them? Okay. This one, update vendors, set vendor active to 0, where vendor ID is in the set you're about to delete. So that's the strong way to do that. I like to avoid this. I like to avoid variables if I can. SQL, if I can stay in pure SQL, this is pure SQL. Basically, this is all I have to do. And then I'm going to get a message that says how many. So basically, that's all I need for the trigger. Instead of delete, don't delete, update the table, set the vendor active to 0, where the vendor ID is in that group. Now, this is, Anna, you might want to take a look at this. This we're also going to do in the next class. Grant, I can grant rights to people. If I say grant, grant select on active vendors to public users, grant update on active users, grant delete and insert on active vendors. Maybe I want to grant the same to the table. I don't have to grant the same to the table. If I grant it to you on active vendors, make sure I get this right. I'm pretty sure that you have it on the underlying table also. So what you have the right to do through the view, no, I'll take that back. I think you have to have it on both the view and the table before you can delete. So I give you delete, but you can't delete. What's going to happen when you try to delete, that trigger is going, we say it fires, bang, the trigger fires. And instead of deleting, it runs that code, this code. So to you deleted. Delete, beep, goodbye, 5 rows. Now you don't see them anymore. They're still there. They've just gone over to the other view. Okay. Now a trigger is not restricted by that with check option. A trigger can change. A trigger acts on the underlying table. The other thing about a trigger is I'm the database owner. When you run a trigger, you run the trigger with my authority. So you can literally do anything. Triggers are very, very powerful, meaning that with a database constraint, consider a constraint. A constraint, I have to look at that field, not null. Is it null? Is it not null? Check to see that the length of that varchar field is greater than 0. Check to see that it's not null. Check to see that it's got at least, I don't know what all we've done. But I can't check to see that that it has children. Check to see that it has at least one field in the invoice line items table. That would be kind of tricky because I would, but I could. If I deleted from there, so if I deleted from invoice line, if I deleted from the invoices, what could I do? I could, with a trigger, go out and delete all of the records in the invoice line items table. I would be very careful with that. Do you really want to delete all of them from invoice line items? Maybe you want to do something like this, where you can undo it. So this gives me an undoable delete that doesn't require me to have to go out and restore the database from my backup. Right? I can undo the delete later. Questions? That trigger is what does it. And that'll be the first topic of, I think the first topic in the advanced class is going to be working with triggers, where we're going to be there for a while. I've got to write that class this summer. Questions? Okay. Let's see. Ms. Renee Ashley, you have your mute turned on, and that's fine. You may. Do you have any questions? Put my headphones on. If you unmute, I would be able to hear you now.
Sorry about that. No, I don't have any questions right now.
Okay, I'm going to talk for a minute briefly. I'm done with the discussion of the views. This stuff we're talking about on the trigger is over and above this class.
Okay.
Okay, it's the next class. Okay, I'm going to take this off. For those of you who are listening to the this class is going to be offered in the summer, the one that we're sitting in now. I've had a fairly high attrition rate this semester, and for those, if you're having trouble in this class, you can take the class in the summer. If you're not happy with your grade and you take the class in the summer and make a higher grade, the higher grade is used on your transcript to calculate your GPA. If you make a lower grade, I think they still use the higher grade. We hope that doesn't happen. Now, if you retake the class, the original grade is still there, but it's not used in your GPA calculation. Sometimes it's better to go ahead and take a undesirable grade rather than taking a W withdrawal. The W's tend to cause you problems in financial aid. Actually, a W is looked at a lot worse by financial aid than an F. A W means you quit. Well, can you do it? Yes. If you beg. You can do about anything if you beg enough. Yeah, you can't just decide to. It has to go through. I have to approve it. Anyway, so this class is going to be offered online. I expect it will be 2 lecture sessions like this a week. And I expect that'll be on a Tuesday and a Thursday evening. If most of the people who are hearing me now, it really doesn't apply to them, because if you're hearing me, that means that you're still active in the class. I'm talking essentially to, I sent out an email on that. And I think the my administration is not going to let me give I've never given a grade of I here, and they've told me that they really frown on it if I give a bunch of I's, because it has to go all the way up to the provost. So it's not easy. We have one more class meeting. Yeah, well, Mr. Wallace is telling me he just, all he wants is an A. Yeah. If I have always wanted to teach a class and say, okay, guys, if you're here now, you get an A, and let's get down to the business of learning how to program. And you know what? People would not like that. I know enough about human behavior to know that they would complain. That's just, it's not what they're expecting. Anyway, we have one more class meeting, and in that one more class meeting, we're going to do indexes, and that is the module 13. So we switched up 13 and 14. Indexes won't take me a whole long time to talk about. It's a very simple little exercise. You'll be able to create an index. Creating an index is just, in the SQL, there's really nothing to it, but an awful lot's going on under the covers of that thing. And there's times to do it, there's times not to do it. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 13. We will probably finish up next week fairly early. You'll be able to get the material from the textbook and the recording if you choose to do it that way. So it's not a real difficult lesson, but it's a real important one. It's one that most people get it pretty quickly. Okay. So it's just got some very clear guidelines. Okay, if there are no questions I need to address, I'm going to end the recording, but I'm going to leave the microphone on. So, ending the recording.